Dealing drugs was an absolute violation of the rules, plain and simple. My uncle and I were 100% against anyone who sold or used drugs. When my uncle became boss, he brought everyone in and he told them the rules. My uncle said it was okay to shake down the drug dealers with the street tax, and it was okay to lend them money with our loan sharking operation. But we were forbidden from getting directly involved with what they were doing. Several members of the Scarfo organization became directly and indirectly involved in the manufacturing and distribution of methamphetamine, more commonly known as meth or crank or speed, by obtaining and reselling phenyl 2-propanone, P2P, to cookers who used P2P oil to make meth. A gallon of P2P could be obtained overseas for under $2,000 and resold to dealers in the United States for $20,000 or more. It was an offer some in the Scarfo mob could not refuse. The first sign of trouble came when Saul Kane got indicted for labor racketeering with Stevie Traits and the Roofers Union, and then got indicted on a federal drug case, which was fucking bullshit. Saul told me he never sold drugs, not a day in his fucking life, and I believe him. The feds alleged that Kane, who was 51 at the time, was the leader of an international drug operation that specialized in importing P2P into the United States, then wholesaling it to various drug operations. The indictment alleged that the operation made in excess of $24 million. Almost as quickly as Saul Kane and several of his top associates were rounded up, one of them began cooperating, and Kane was held without bail. Several other alleged Philadelphia meth dealers were rounded up in separate indictments that charged them with importing P2P and distributing meth. Shortly after they were charged, several of these individuals began to cooperate and point the finger at various made members within the Scarfo mob, including Ralph Jr. Stanio, Charles Charlie White, Ian Each, Thomas Tommy Del Giorno, and Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi, as being directly or indirectly involved in importing, manufacturing, and distributing both P2P and methamphetamine. Indictments were being prepared, but for tactical reasons, they were kept under seal. Around this time, Caramandi became acquainted with a Philadelphia city councilman from South Philadelphia named Leland Beloff, and Beloff's aide, Robert RICO. We knew Leland Beloff. He came every year to our Christmas party and always paid his respects to my uncle if we saw him out somewhere. In turn, we'd have the union support him during his elections, and he'd do little favors for us from time to time. So, as the Crow starts getting more involved with the construction stuff, he comes into contact with Beloff, who, as councilman, had a lot of influence over what projects would go forward and what projects would not. So, one day, the Crow comes down to see my uncle, and he asks for permission to start doing business deals with Beloff. My uncle gives him the go-ahead, but says, "Be careful. Use your head." The Crow was caught trying to extort $1 million from a prominent Philadelphia land developer, using and mentioning his connections to both Leland Beloff and Nicky Scarfo in his dealings with a representative for the developer, who was actually an undercover FBI agent. On June 27th, 1986, Caramandi was arrested, but 11 days later, the charges against him were dropped. Another problem Nicky Scarfo was having at the time was with Tommy Del Giorno, one of the men supervising his mob's street operation in South Philadelphia. The same thing that had happened towards the end with Chucky was happening with Tommy Del. He was drunk 7 days a fucking week, and my uncle took him down just like he did to Chucky. My uncle said to me, "We gotta get this thing back on track, from top to fucking bottom." He knew our organization was in bad fucking shape. What Scarfo had no way of knowing at that time was exactly how bad things actually were, with Tommy Del Giorno taken down from captain to soldier. The 39-year-old Francis Fafi Inarella became the family's new Philadelphia street boss. There was just a sense that things were falling apart around us. It's hard to explain. But the regime, it just wasn't the same after Salvi got killed. And then the thing with Chucky and Lawrence. It just kept going downhill from there. In October of 1986, Nicholas "Nick the Crow" Caramandi was rearrested in the extortion case involving Willard Rouse, the real estate developer he tried to shake down for $1 million. He was held in a Philadelphia prison without bail. At Caramandi's bail hearing, the U.S. attorney laid out for the judge the government's belief that Caramandi was a career criminal and made member of the Scarfo mob, while also claiming that Caramandi figured prominently in both the P2P case, which remained under seal, and the 1983 murder of Pascal Pat the Cat's Burrito. Caramandi, who had known Scarfo since the early 1970s, understood that the volatile mob boss was furious that Caramandi had talked so recklessly in mentioning both Scarfo's name and La Cosa Nostra when dealing with the man he was trying to extort, who was both an FBI agent and wearing a wire. The Crow was a con artist, a fucking flimflammer. He wasn't a gangster, but he always had some scheme going, and once in a while, whatever he was doing would hit pretty big, and we'd make a lot of money. So, my uncle kinda, sorta tolerated him. My uncle had told him to be careful and use his fucking head. But the Crow decided to act like a gangster, which he wasn't, and started shooting off at the fucking mouth, playing a role, and ended up burying himself. On November 3rd, 1986, the New Jersey Attorney General's office unsealed an indictment against Nicky Scarfo, Philip Leonettii, and 16 others, charging them with racketeering, money laundering, and bookmaking. The backbone of the case was a series of secretly recorded wiretap conversations in which a drunken Tommy Del Giorno openly discussed mob activity and expressed his dissatisfaction with his mob superiors, namely Little Nicky and Crazy Phil.
Capo Thomas Del Giorno lived here at Ocean Colony in Ocean City. But inside this condo, while the mobsters were talking, the cops were listening. The New Jersey State Police bugged Del Giorno's place and moved several female undercover officers into the complex to listen in on Del Giorno's poolside chats. After 2 years of surveillance, the police pulled in Del Giorno. He would become the first high-ranking member of La Cosa Nostra to turn informant.
When Del Giorno was confronted with those tapes and realized that Scarfo was ready to do him in, I think that was the initial major breakthrough in the downfall of the Scarfo organization.
Tommy Del knew that once Scarfo and Leonetti heard the tapes, he would become a dead man walking, as the two mob leaders predictably made bail shortly after they were arraigned, posting $400,000 and $300,000, respectively. The other 16 defendants named in the indictment were given court dates for early January.
But the tide would begin to turn on Scarfo when Tommy Del Giorno was confronted with those surveillance tapes from his Ocean City condo.
There's very little doubt that when those tapes were played for Del Giorno by the New Jersey State Police investigators, he realized the jig was up. It was time to make your best deal. Let's cut our losses and run.
A week later, Tommy Del Giorno became the first made member of the Scarfo mob to defect from the Cosa Nostra and enter into an agreement to cooperate with the government. 3 days later, Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi would become the second. Both men were now cooperating with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the multiple investigations that were ongoing against Nicodemo Scarfo, Philip Leonettii, and the entire Philadelphia, Atlantic City, La Cosa Nostra. Investigations which included all of the unsolved mob murders that Scarfo and Leonetti had ordered and participated in, dating back to their early Atlantic City days in the late 70s, up through the Frankie Flowers murder in July 1985. I remember Bobby Simone came down after the news of Tommy Dell and Nick the Crow broke and said, "Nick, it's not good." And my uncle knew it. He says to Bobby, "How long before they come to get me?" It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a year. But they're definitely coming. As the feds meticulously debriefed Del Giorno and Caramandi in separate locations, they were obtaining an insight into the dark world of La Cosa Nostra under the dictatorial leadership of Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo.
The Ocean City surveillance would eventually lead to the downfall of Scarfo, but for 2 years the state police bug went undetected, and during that time, Little Nicky's biggest obstacle appeared to come in the form of a hunchback, barely 5 feet tall.
Harry the Hunchback Riccobini was a longtime Bruno ally who had refused to acknowledge Scarfo as boss. The Scarfo street war with Riccobini was the bloodiest of his reign. In the end, 15 of 20 Riccobini soldiers would be killed in this battle, which failed to claim the 4'10" mobster himself, who managed to survive 2 hits, including one in which he was shot at a point-blank range while sitting in his car and emerged unscathed.
Drove out to his house, and in his driveway was this car that was blown to bits, and I made a comment that they tried to kill you again. Harry says, "Oh, no, what makes you say that?" I said, "Well, Harry," I said, "there's bullet holes all over your car." And Harry made a sarcastic remark to the effect, "Well, the vandals in this neighborhood are just horrible, Mr. Friel." I said, "But Harry, it looks like you've got a graze across the top of your skull." And Harry said, "Oh, no," he said, "I bumped my head going in the door." Well, as I said, Harry's 4'10", the door's, about 7 foot.
Scarfo emerged from the Riccobini Wars here in South Philadelphia victorious. The bloodshed of the 80s and the passing of the old guard made it possible for a new generation of mobster to emerge, a younger, untested version, a factor which would eventually lead to Scarfo's downfall.
One of those young soldiers was Sal Testa, son of the late mob boss. Scarfo felt that with his growing power, Testa would someday emerge as a threat and may not wait for a period of natural ascension. So Scarfo ordered that he be killed, something easier said than done. It would take a half-dozen tries, including one in Ocean City, before they would get it right.
The conspiracy that eventually led to Sal Testa's death is almost comical because it reminds you of the old book, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, because they tried innumerable attempts to kill Sal Testa and were eventually successful in 1984.
But the tide would begin to turn.
Right before Christmas of that year, in '86, me and my uncle headed down to Florida, to Casablanca South, for a few days. It was gloom and doom ever since we found out those guys had flipped. I went back to Atlantic City right before New Year's, '87, and my uncle stayed down there for a few more days with his girlfriend at the time, who we all called Chicago. On January 7th, 1987, The remaining 16 defendants in the New Jersey State racketeering indictment were all arraigned and subsequently released on bail. Among those charged were Francis Fafi Inarella, Scarfo's Philadelphia street boss, Joseph Joe Punch Punciatori, Joseph Grande, and his brother Salvatore Wayne Grande, all four of whom were allegedly involved in the Salvatore Testa murder, and Joseph Legambi, the alleged triggerman in the Frankie Flowers murder. The next day, January 8th, 1987, would mark Nicodemo Scarfo's final day as a free man, as the 57-year-old Mafia Don emerged from an airport flight from Fort Lauderdale to Atlantic City. He was swarmed by a half-dozen FBI agents. Scarfo was taken into custody on charges that he had conspired with Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi and Philadelphia City Councilman Leland Beloff in the attempted $1 million extortion from Philadelphia land developer Willard Rouse. Scarfo would then be transferred to a detention center in Philadelphia to await a bail hearing. Less than a week later, Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo was formally denied bail. His 33-year-old nephew, Philip Leonettii, was now the acting boss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob. When my uncle went to jail, we were in real bad shape. It wasn't like when he was in Latuna, and me, Chucky, Lawrence, and Salvi kept things going. This time around, there was no one left. Salvi was dead, and Chucky was in a jail cell in Camden. Lawrence, he wasn't really around anymore. It was basically me and Fafi, and guys like Joe Punch. We all had cases pending, and we knew we were going to get locked up. It was only a matter of time. For the first 2 months of 1987, Philip Leonettii attempted to use men like Francis Fafi Inarella in Philadelphia and Pascal Patty Specs Martirano in North Jersey to carry out his uncle's orders. Orders that basically consisted of making sure the Scarfo street tax and tribute money were being collected and sent down to Leonetti in Atlantic City for his uncle's safekeeping. I was meeting a couple of times a week with Bobby Simone, and Bobby had introduced me to a lawyer friend of his, Oscar Goldman, from Las Vegas. Bobby tells me, Oscar's one of the best lawyers in the country. If you get arrested, I want him sitting right next to you. I was going to see my uncle once or twice a week in Philadelphia, and I'd go see Fafi when I got done visiting my uncle to pick up our money or to hear what was going on in Philadelphia. I was basically just going through the motions, doing what my uncle wanted. But my heart was wasn't in it anymore. I knew it was only a matter of time before it was lights out. In early March, Leonetti and Maria boarded a plane and headed to Scarfo's South Florida estate, Casablanca South. It was me and Maria, and we had a ball down there. It was just the two of us. We would sit by the pool all day, or take the boat out. Those 2 weeks were like being in heaven. With everything that was going on, I knew the reality of the situation we were in, but I didn't want to face it. Several weeks later, on April 9th, 1987, Philip Leonettii would be forced to face that reality when he was arrested as he drove from Atlantic City to Philadelphia to meet with Bobby Simone. It was me and Tori Scafidi in the car, and I noticed the whole time we were driving that we were being followed by what seemed like at least 5 cars. I say to Tori, I think I'm going to be arrested. We drove over the Ben Franklin Bridge and into Center City and headed towards Bobby's office, which was near Rittenhouse Square. When we got to 19th and Walnut, the cops were everywhere. They came from behind us. They came the wrong way down Walnut and got in front of us. They came from the fucking park. They were everywhere. They grabbed me and Tori, cuffed us, and put us in separate cars. Bobby must have seen all of the commotion and came down from his office. When he came over to the car, I said to him, Bobby, what am I being arrested for? And he said, the murder of Selvi Testa. Police records show Leonetti and Scafidi were arrested at 1:40 p.m. 15 minutes later, at 1:55 p.m., Francis Fafi Inarella was arrested inside the Scarfo mob's primary clubhouse, a social club at the corner of Kamak and Moore, in the heart of South Philadelphia, half a block away from Passyunk Avenue, and the candy shop where Selvi Testa was executed. By 6 p.m. that night, Joseph Joe Pungatore, Salvatore Wayne Grande, and his brother Joseph, all former members of Selvi Testa's Young Executioners crew, and the 3 principals charged in his murder, were behind bars with Leonetti, Inarella, and Scafidi. A separate indictment, unsealed the next day, charged Nicodemo Scarfo and the entire hierarchy of his criminal organization with numerous racketeering offenses, including the murder of Judge Edwin Helfand, Vincent Falcone, John Calabrese, Frank Chicky Narducci, Pat Spirito, Sammy Tamburino, and Robert Riccobini. And finally, the murder of Salvatore Salvi Testa. Several attempted murders and dozens of other crimes were included in the indictment, which was based primarily on the testimony from cooperating witnesses, Thomas Tommy Del Giorno, and Nicholas Nick the Crow Caramandi, both of whom had defected from the mob, November of '86. We were all in jail, and none of us got bail. The only guy that they let out on bail was Joe Punch's brother, Anthony. The rest of us were locked up in one of two prisons, either Holmesburg or the detention center, both of which were in Philly. I was in Holmesburg with my uncle, Joe Legambi, Lawrence, Joe Punch, Fafi, and a couple of other guys. I think Tori was with us, and the Narducci brothers. My uncle was getting ready to go on trial in the Rouse extortion case, and the rest of us, we were just getting acclimated to being locked up. Prior to that, none of us had ever been locked up for more than a couple of days, except for my uncle. A few weeks later, on May 6th, 1987, a federal jury convicted Nicodemo Scarfo of conspiracy and extortion, stemming from his involvement in the attempted extortion of Philadelphia land developer Willard Rouse. On August 4th, 1987, Nicky Scarfo was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison following his conviction in the Rouse case. The next thing that happened is that me, my uncle, Chucky, Fafi, Junior Stainio, and Charlie White all got hit with an 848 continuing criminal enterprise on the P2P case, which they unsealed when we got locked up. Of all the cases they tried to bring, this one was the absolute worst. I mean, we did a lot of shit. Murder, loan sharking, extortion, you name it. But we were not drug dealers. The jury in that case agreed and acquitted Scarfo, Leonetti, Merlino, and Inarella of all charges. Ralph Jr. Stainio and Charles Charlie White E&H were both fugitives, and at that time, neither had been caught. When the jury found us not guilty, the courtroom went nuts. Down in the holding cell, we were celebrating, hugging and kissing each other on the fucking cheek. It was the first time in almost 2 years that me and my uncle were together with Chucky, and everything seemed normal between us, just like old times. We were all so happy that we beat that fucking case. Drug dealers? Get the fuck out of here. When we got back to Holmesburg, the whole place went nuts. They had seen that we won on TV. Guys were banging on their doors, cheering. When we got back to our cell block, which was D block, everyone was lined up waiting for us. Lawrence, Joe Punch, Joe Lagambi, Philip and Frankie Narducci. It felt real good to beat the government. Again. As the Testa murder trial began in Philadelphia Common Pleas Court, Leonetti felt confident in facing Caramandi and Del Giorno, having just prevailed several months prior in the P2P case. It was me, my uncle, Chucky, Faffy, Joey Punch, Tori, Wayne and Joe Grande, and Charlie White that were on trial. Bobby Simone represented my uncle. I had Oscar Goldman. Chucky had Ed Jacobs. I'll never forget how Bobby told the jury in his opening statement that, members of the jury, you will never hear testimony from people more corrupt, more disgusting, meaning the Crow and Tommy Dell.
As informant, Thomas Del Giorno would get his first major shot at his former boss in the murder trial of Salvatore Testa. However, this case, which appeared to be airtight against Scarfo, ended in a not guilty verdict, leaving law enforcement officials baffled and wondering, would they ever be able to get Scarfo?
A point we'll explore tomorrow night in Part 3 of Disorganized Crime.
You have to understand, I was charged in the Pepe Leiva murder, and that case got dismissed. I was found not guilty in the Falcone murder, not guilty in the P2P case, and not guilty in the Testa murder. I was 4 for 4. I knew Bobby and the other lawyers had Tommy Dell and the Crow's number down pat. And I was very confident going into the RICO case. All of us felt confident going into the RICO case because 2 different juries had rejected the testimony of Del Giorno and Caramandi. This was it. This was the big one. If I won this one, I was home free. My uncle had to do the 14 years on the Rouse case, and him, Chucky, the Narduccis, Faffy, Lawrence, the Milanos, and Joe Lagambi, they still had to go to trial for the Flowers murder. But I wasn't in that one. So, this was it for me. were armed with a massive indictment that charged Scarfo, Leonetti, and 15 others with participating in 14 murders and attempted murders, and a slew of other RICO predicate offenses, including extortion, loan sharking, bookmaking, and the distribution of P2P. The indictment charged the hierarchy of the crime family as follows. In their opening statement, the government promised to give the jurors a window into the world of La Cosa Nostra, focusing on crimes committed between 1976 and 1987, the heyday of Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo and his nephew, Philip Michael Leonetti. The trial started at the end of September, after a few weeks of jury selection, and went all the way through October and into November. Every day was the same routine. They would wake us up at around 5 a.m. and transport us to court in a bus with tinted windows. We would be handcuffed and shackled on the bus, and they would lead us into the courthouse to a basement holding cell, where we would get dressed and be in the courtroom by 9 a.m. The trial was basically Tommy Dell and The Crow, and a bunch of FBI agents and cops, all of who had followed us over the years. They had some audio tapes and a ton of fucking pictures. They even brought in Joe Salerno to testify against us. And they had a bunch of bookmakers and drug dealers we had shaken down. The further the trial went, the more it became apparent that we were literally fighting for our lives, and that the government was playing for keeps. They wanted us real fucking bad. By the end of October, I think we were all worn down. We'd have some good days here and there, and then we would have some really bad days. The trial was definitely taking its toll on all of us. One day, while the Crow was on the stand, we took our regular afternoon break. We would all go back into a holding pen, and there were these little conference rooms where we could meet with the lawyers when they came back. So Bobby comes back and calls me and my uncle into one of the conference rooms, and he says to us, "I have some bad news." And you could just tell by looking at Bobby that it was bad. It was written all over his face. Then he says to us, "Mark tried to kill himself this morning. They found him hanging in the bathroom of Scarfing. They flew him from Atlantic City to Philadelphia on a helicopter, and he's in ICU at Hahnemann Hospital. It doesn't look good." I remember welling up with tears and feeling nauseous, like I was gonna throw up. This kid was 17 years old and was a beautiful kid, well behaved, good looking, always respectful. He was my uncle's youngest son, his baby. And as Bobby is telling us this, Bobby's choked up. I've got tears in my eyes. And my uncle, this no good, evil motherfucker, has absolutely no reaction, no emotion, no nothing. He's just standing there, doesn't say a word, doesn't flinch, never bats a fucking eye. So now we're all in the holding pen, in the basement, waiting for the bus to take us back to Holmesburg. No one is saying a word. Every day after court, when we were heading back, we'd always be breaking balls. You gotta remember, there were 17 of us, and we're all looking at spending the rest of our lives in prison. We had to do something to lighten the mood. But on this day, no one said nothing. It was dead fucking silence. Then, out of nowhere, my uncle goes nuts and explodes on me. His eyes got real big and he's pointing at me, screaming, "You know, I blame this on you and your mother. The way she would scream and holler at Mark, and that vein would come out of her fucking throat. This is your fault. You and that witch sister of mine. You're just like her." While this was going on, all the guys we were on trial with were all sitting on the benches up against the wall in the holding cell, staring straight at the floor. None of them made eye contact with either one of us, and none of them said a word. Here I am sitting there, absolutely disgusted. Not only was I disgusted over what happened with Mark, I was also disgusted with myself. I'm 35 years old, sitting in this holding cell, cuffed and shackled. I'm looking at spending the rest of my life in prison. I dedicated every waking moment of my adult life to my uncle and COSA NOSTRA. And this no good, evil motherfucker is going to sit there and blame me for his son trying to kill himself. But the thing with me The thing that always made me smarter than him is the fact that no one, including him, ever knew what I was thinking, what I was feeling. I could read him like a book. I always knew what he was going to do before he even thought about doing it. He was predictable, my uncle. Mentally, he played checkers with me, where I played chess with him. At that moment, sitting in that cell, listening to him blame me for Mark, I don't know if I have ever felt such a combination of raw emotion and such rage, both at the same time. I am not the kind of guy who's gonna get into a screaming match with anybody, let alone in front of 15 other guys, and let my opponent or adversary know what I was thinking. And at that very moment, he was no longer my uncle. He was no longer my boss. He was my adversary. My enemy. I made up my mind right there in that split second. My life was going to go one of two ways. Number one, if I won the RICO case, I was taking Maria, little Philip, and my mother, and we were out of here. No more Atlantic City. No more Philadelphia. No more mob. And no more of my uncle. I was done with it all. Done. Number two. If I lost the RICO case, I was going to cooperate with the feds, even if they still gave me 100 years. I didn't care. This was about breaking with my uncle. Breaking from the COSA NOSTRA. It wasn't about jail time. The time didn't matter to me. It never did. If I never saw the light of day, so be it. But I was going to live the rest of my days for me, for Maria, for my kid, for my mother, not for my fucking uncle, and not for his La Cosa Nostra. As the RICO trial continued, with the unrelenting onslaught from the federal prosecutors and the overwhelming depth of the government's case, Leonetti knew his chances for an acquittal were slim at best. On November 19th, 1988, after 2 full days of deliberation, the jury convicted Nicodemo Scarfo, Philip Leonettii, and all 15 co-defendants of every charge in the indictment.
Tonight we continue our probe into the world of organized crime in South Jersey with a look at the downfall of Nicky Scarfo.
A downfall that would set in motion a series of events that would reach far into other organized crime families. Tonight, in part 3 of our series, Disorganized Crime, we begin with Scarfo's last big break before his reign as Don would come to an end.
Devastated, absolutely devastated. It was the absolute low point of my career in law enforcement.
The point to which Frank Friel speaks was Scarfo's not guilty verdict in the South Testa murder case, a verdict which left law enforcement officials wondering if they would ever be able to get Scarfo on something long-term, a point flaunted by Scarfo himself, who sent Friel a special thanks for his help in the trial. Law enforcement officials, however, would get the last laugh in the form of a RICO case that would allow them to try Scarfo on a laundry list of charges, evidence gathered in large part through the help of the New Jersey State Police.
I'm proud of that fact. It was the fact that a New Jersey detective, Lieutenant Ed Johnson, was the one that turned Tom Del Giorno, and as a result of that, 5 additional members turned, and that was really the demise of Scarfo and most of his hierarchy.
The testimony of Del Giorno and others in the Scarfo family against the boss enabled the feds to charge Nicky with crimes dating back to the 1970s under the far-reaching RICO statute, including the murders of Summers Point Municipal Court Judge Edwin Helfant, mobster Vincent Falcone, and Capo Sal Testa. After a month of testimony and 2 days of deliberation and the trial, the verdict was in. Scarfo was found guilty of 8 of the 9 murders against him and sentenced to 55 years in prison. Law enforcement had finally won, just because Scarfo was...
In the end, there was too much for us to overcome. All the killings, all the violence, all the treachery. It was almost like we made it easy for them to convict us. I mean, how could they not? With everything they heard? I know this sounds crazy, but when they found us guilty, I felt such a huge sense of relief. I knew we were finished, and I knew that this life, La Cosa Nostra, was over for me.